English has been influenced by many languages, such as Old Nordic, French, and Anglo-Saxon, but none have had quite the same impact as Latin. Latin had its first major impact on English in 597 AD when Augustine widely spread Christianity in the islands of Britain, and a second during the European Renaissance. These new infusions of Latin to English helped shape the course of languages for centuries to come. However, it is necessary to show not only why and how these language infusions began, but also the context in which certain words developed. When Christianity was brought to Britain, it also brought new Latin words and caused great Latin influence on English. But in the first century, Britain had an almost completely pagan community, and it wasn't until Roman artisans and traders spread the word about Jesus and this new religion that a small percentage of the population converted. Christianity was initially not well accepted, but it was different from other cults at the time and required that they only followed the one true God, and followers could not dabble in other cults. As a result, Christians were persecuted and forced to worship in secret. In 313 AD, Constantine saw potential in Christianity as a force to unite nations and decided to tolerate it. By the 4th century, the population of Christians had increased, but pagans still dominated the island. The Anglo-Saxon and Jutes took over the island and established their respective kingdoms and gathered a reputation for being savage. Finally, in 597 AD, Augustine brought a mission to Britain. He landed in Kent, which fortunately already had a small Christian community, and the king there allowed them to spread their religion freely, and, inadvertently, Latin as well. These spread slowly and peacefully, with no martyrs. Augustine succeeded in converting much of the population and eventually went on to become Archbishop of Canterbury in 601 AD. Under his direction, cities underwent major changes. Churches and monasteries were built and used for education, not only of sacred literature and scripture, but also poetry, astronomy, and arithmetic. Language changed during this time as well. The Roman alphabet was adopted as well as many Latin words. There was a great boom in literature. Famous figures such as the poet Caedmon, historian Venerable Bede, and the scholar Alcuin of York became writers of some of the earliest Old English sources in the 7th and 8th centuries. Caedmon's hymn is now considered by many as the oldest surviving text of Old English. At this time, Old English and French were the primary languages. Latin was usually written, but was almost always studied as a second language. The Bible was in Latin, church services were in Latin, and people at monasteries and ministers all spoke Latin, so there was much to gain from learning Latin. When Latin was spoken at this time, it was primarily used as a language of debate in scholarly and ecclesiastical places. Text was usually read aloud at this time, and silent reading alone was not a common occurrence.
The Renaissance is one of the most important cultural developments in the history of Europe that, among other important effects, planted the seeds of Latin influence into English. It began in Italy during the 14th century, drawing on the classical cultures of Rome and Greece. One key factor in the spreading of Renaissance ideas was the recent innovation of the printing press. It allowed for new thoughts to be spread quickly and accurately, and made it more difficult for the church to suppress ideas they did not approve of. The Renaissance spawned 4 major ideas that are still central to Western thought today: secularism, humanism, individualism, and skepticism. Secularism was essentially the movement from believing that the main point of living was to provide and prepare for the next life to focusing on this current life. Humanism is the belief that humans, not God, are the center of the universe. Individualism is an extension of humanism. It states that individual humans are capable of great achievement. During this time, artists began to sign their own works showing individual pride, and the guild system was being replaced by capitalism, which encouraged private enterprise, all as a result of individualism. Finally, skepticism promotes curiosity and the questioning of authority. Later, after the Italian Renaissance was thoroughly underway, Northern Europe began its own Renaissance around 1450. The Northern Renaissance was delayed due to 2 key factors. First, Northern Europe was further removed from centers of trade and culture in the Mediterranean, and the political and scientific institutions were more backwards due to the stronger presence of the church and feudalism. Besides beginning later, the Northern Renaissance was also more religious due to a heightened influence of the church, and more nationalistic as a result of the rising monarchies. From the Renaissance came the Humanist movement, which lasted from the mid-1300s to the 1500s. Humanists studied subjects now known as the humanities, such as ethics, history, and poetry. In the 1300s, humanists began finding Latin manuscripts, and when the popularity of the printing press grew in the 15th century, these were distributed to a greater number of people. Latin texts had been known, but humanists made them a large part of the ideal curriculum. Greek also enjoyed a rebirth. Manuel Chrysoloras brought classical Greek texts to Italy in 1397 and caused a revolution. Greek was translated into Latin, and Italian humanists gained an understanding of the gaps between their world and the Romans they sought to be like.
During the rise of Christianity in the early 600s AD, much of the Church's written text was in Latin. As a result, many Latin words were borrowed or combined with pre-existing English words. Several Latin words taken in at this time expressed abstract concepts that were difficult to word in English. The Latin alphabet was also adopted because it already suited many English tones. Tones that were not in the Latin alphabet were taken from Old Anglo-Saxon runes. Some examples of Latin-derived words from this time include disciple, angel, and trinity. The English Renaissance, also known as the Elizabethan era or the Age of Shakespeare, occurred from roughly the 16th century to the early 17th century. During this time, enthusiasm for classical languages led to the borrowing of many words from Latin. Writers often wanted to explore the language, or impress or surprise their readers. Writers didn't worry about readers not understanding the new words because they assumed the reader had a classical education. Also, when people were translating Latin to English and couldn't find a satisfactory translation, they often used some variation of the original Latin word. These new Latin-derived words were not always accepted, and the most contrived or excessive words were disparagingly called inkhorns. There was no obvious pattern for whether one of these newly coined words survived or died. For example, the word recapitulate stayed, while the word reencephalize, which had the same meaning and a similar level of complexity, did not. During the same time, several people took part in a counter-movement to use older English words or create new words from Germanic roots. However, most of these words did not last. Some examples are sicker for certainly and ense for conclusion.
La 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 la. Some words came directly from Latin with little change. For example, the English word genius was spelled exactly the same way in Latin and has the same meaning. However, some Latin words change more when they are incorporated into English. For example, the adjective dexter in Latin meaning right-handed or skillful. When the word was introduced to English during the English Renaissance, its meaning shifted slightly. Old English already had the word recht in it, a Germanic word to mean right. Therefore, dexterous lost the redundant definition of right-handed, while the definition skillful remained. The dexter part of dexterous came from the stem of the Latin word dexter. The ous suffix also comes from Latin. It originated from the Latin suffix osus, which could be used to form adjectives. When the suffix was adopted into French, it became shortened to simply os or us. At the time, the suffix was pronounced with a long u. Old and Middle English, that vowel was written ou. Therefore, it became to be spelled as ous in English. The pronunciation is changed over time in a process known as assimilation. This is when a sound changes to a nearby sound. Assimilation occurs for this word because saying dexterous is easier than saying dextrous. However, when the pronunciation changed, the spelling remained the same. Another example of a word which comes from Latin is the word legalis, meaning law. This word was simply brought over and the is was dropped, which is where the word legal comes from today.
A large percentage of our current vocabulary comes from Latin. Most of that influence was recorded between the 1350s and the 1700s, during which the aforementioned renaissances occurred, and people had elevated enthusiasm for classical languages. Of all the languages to make their mark on English, Latin has had one of the greatest impacts.